Did you know what you were getting into with the
this.
book? Yeah.
No, I didn't. And it was, but in a way, I'm kind of really glad that I didn't know, because I went into talking to these people with no agenda. I really was just like talking to boys, like saying, just tell me about your life. Like, what concerns you? What are you worried about? What do you love? What do you hate? I thought like it was going to be blood from a stone. But it was like the complete opposite. They were like desperate to talk. They went on and on, in the most lovely and articulate way. They just, every conversation like went hours over what I'd scheduled, because I think they felt so unheard and like nobody's listening. So
Welcome everyone to another episode of Under the Hood Talk. Again, this is the podcast where we talk about the things that are under talked about in the world of boys and men, and hence get under the hood. And really excited to have Ruth Whippman here, all the way from California. We're lucky enough to have her in the New York studio. She is an author, a documentarian, overall cultural critic and contributor. So really excited to get your ideas. Author of BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Time of Impossible Masculinity. And we have a lot to talk about there. And also Anxious America. So thank you for being here. Really excited to meet you and get to talk through all things boyhood, BoyMom, and masculinity.
it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're lucky the timing worked out to be in the New York studio together.
Yeah.
I would love to continue to introduce you to the audience and hear a bit more about your background and why these topics are so important to you and so important to talk about.
Yeah, so I am a journalist and an author, obviously, as you just said, and I'm also the mom of 3 boys. And the third one, my youngest son, was born like literally as the Me Too movement was just exploding online. So I was like 972 months pregnant with him. And then I was just seeing, knowing that I was going to have a third son, right? That was about to be the mom of only boys. And there was this just like conversation just like exploding outside my window, which was just, one after another. It seemed like pretty much every man in America, every man globally was being exposed as a sexual predator, which obviously was not the case. But in my like super angsty pregnant mind just felt terrifying. And, I'm a feminist and obviously like a very devoted mother of boys. And it just brought up all these extremely conflicted emotions for me, just like, how am I going to raise my sons? There was this whole conversation unfolding about toxic masculinity and male harm and all the ways in which men were terrible. And I was like, what do I do here? So I decided to kind of do what I know how to do, which is report and research. So the book that I ended up writing is a combination of memoir, so just my own experience raising my 3 sons in this really, really fraught and complicated moment, and just reporting on what's going on with boys and men and masculinity in this time.
Super cool. And I think the word that stuck out to me from your title, and you kind of touched on a little bit, is the impossible masculinity, the paradox of there's all the like fraught environment and bad things and bad people, but then I want to raise my boys to be these great, amazing people.
Yeah.
And there's so many different paths they could take. Why is it impossible?
Yeah. So I used that phrase impossible masculinity really deliberately. I think there was an idea that we would call it in the time of toxic masculinity. And I really didn't want to go in that direction, partly because I think that phrase obviously has its place and named a phenomenon that's really important. But I think it's just got to the point where it's so upsetting and confining for boys and men. There's just this idea that they are toxic. It's kind of taken on that thing. So, and with impossible masculinity, I think what I was trying to convey is this idea that masculinity can often feel impossible from all directions. So like there's this way in which it's kind of always been impossible, like this idea of what it means to be a man, which is, be don't show vulnerability, don't show weakness, man up, squash your feelings, be a superhero, be this tough guy, which is like by definition almost impossible, and I think is a reason why men and boys really struggle. They've got this impossible ideal to live up to, and they're kind of held to this impossible standard, which is obviously often like a really sort of unhealthy standard. And then at the same time, there's this sort of newer discourse, which is like, not only do you have to conform to this like impossible standard, and we're still holding you to that, but we're also going to tell you you're terrible, you suck, you're a predator. The best that you can do with your life is to like not be a racist and to the best you can do with your life is to not be a rapist and to like shut up, pipe down, let everybody else sort of step forward and have a turn. So I think it's just this really difficult thing for this generation of boys to navigate.
Yeah, no, it's a helpful breakdown of what the word impossible. It's this impossible performance,
right?
Where you can't be all of those things.
Right. And I think it's often really contradictory, because I think at the same time we still hold boys and men to this old standard. So like be a tough guy, be masculine, make the first move, be aggressive, be dominating. And then we've got this newer thing, which is like, never overstep or you're a creep. Never take up too much space. Don't be too aggressive. Be really cautious. Be really sensitive. You might get cancelled. You might get accused of something. And so I think it's just like for your average boy or a young man trying to navigate that, it's just like, well, what am I supposed to do? We're expecting both of them and they're totally contradictory.
Mm-hmm. And in addition, I think, I can hardly even fathom growing up in a time with the just sheer amount of information and content geared at 11, 12, 13-year-old eyeballs. So I can only imagine trying to download all of that at once to your growing brain.
Yeah.
So all this is happening out there. You're curious, you're investigating, but you're also like managing the microcosm that is your household.
Yeah.
So what are the challenges you felt in kind of translating, like you want them to know about it, but learn on their own? And so what were some of the challenges you experienced in raising them with this happening outside your window, as you put it?
Yeah, so I think it was just a huge amount of pressure, because I think there's this idea that it's like all on me, that I've got to kind of fix this in my home. And that as a feminist, it's this huge amount of pressure to turn out this like perfect feminist son who's never going to like do any of those terrible bad things that those men have done, which is, obviously something that I want to do for myself. But, it also doesn't leave much room for like making mistakes, being a kid, just being a normal human who's fallible and flawed. So that felt like a lot of pressure. And I think, look, I'd grown up with this. I had a very feminist mom, and I kind of grew up with this idea that like all of gender is socialized, that boys only behave badly because we let them behave badly, or we let them get away with it in some way, and that we socialize girls to be like compliant and docile, and we socialize boys to be like naughty and rambunctious and rude, and we kind of let them off the hook. So I went into the whole thing of parenting being like, my sons will never be those like terrible, rude, rowdy, whatever boys. And then, of course, I was smacked over the face with, my boys conform to all the boy stereotypes. They love fighting. They love Nerf guns. They loved weapons. They, they were incredibly physical, incredibly active. They did not like to sit still and color in a notebook or whatever it was. So, I think they were like just day-to-day challenges, just like keeping them, one's like climbing up the curtains and one's like running out the door, and two are, fighting. And I'm just like, how do I keep control of this situation? So just at a very, very basic level. But then there's this other layer where all these behaviors aren't just like normal childhood or normal boyhood behaviors. They're like, they come really freighted with all this baggage of like, if my child is wrestling with his brother on the living room rug, or if he punches his brother, or if he wants to buy a Nerf gun, or, does this mean he's a future school shooter? Or, it comes with this horrible political context. It's not just what it is. So I think I just found it a time of really deep anxiety. That, I started writing the book when the kids were pretty little. now they're older, my oldest is 15, he's a teenager, so he's navigating more of these like online spaces and those sorts of things, so those are huge challenges too.
Yeah, it's I think when you are kind of investigating the outside world and exploring how it translates to like your own inner world, it's super personal. That's such an interesting challenge that you were taking on. And then you also mentioned like a school shooter is like this super extreme violent archetype of like the most lost, troubled, sick boy that could be out there. And those archetypes obviously get a lot of attention and like attachment to like male. It's a very particularly white male archetype. So what are these scary stories that are super real, like a school shooter, like the incel community or the Me Too and like rapists, like these very scary, triggering, anxiety-inducing, fearful things doing for like image and identity, where like you want to be cognizant of it, but not just dominated by fear of those things.
Right, and you want to feel like you can give your boys something positive to hold on to. You don't want it to just be like, don't be a school shooter, don't be a rapist, and that's the best you can hope for. But I think, there's a lot of positive messaging for girls at the moment, which I fully support, girl power, and you can be anything and reach for the stars, and, you go girl. And I think it's in this time where white men have like hoarded so much power, those kinds of messages feel really kind of off key for talking about boys in this moment. You don't want to be too like with your own like future privileged white male children. You don't want to be too much like grab everything you can, because white men have historically done that. But at the same time, of course you want your own children to like be their best selves, to succeed, and also to think about other people. And I think it's just like a really, really complex and high pressure matrix to be in.
Yeah, no, it's a great counter of like, we just need like all those negatives are out there and very real, and just filling more positive, nuanced examples of men to look up to and celebrate.
Right, and I think there's also this like built-in problem, which is like men are taught to see that anything coded as like feminine or girly is like emasculating or humiliating. So a lot of those qualities that you want your boys to embody, which are like nurturing, caring, empathetic, being part of a community rather than go-getting for the individual, those things are set up as being, for women, for girls. So it's really hard. Like girl power is like an aspirational slogan, whereas like boy nurture, boy empathy, it's much harder to sell to boys, who've been taught to like avoid that stuff at all costs,
Yeah. No, the messaging of nuance is not the most clickable or downloadable thing. So it's a harder message. And I know from like watching the manosphere, like where that community of online influencers is such a draw, because they're saying, come as you are, we'll take all your tendencies, all your aggression, like without restraint. And that's a very like cloying, very tempting like celebration of like, just be a man.
Just be yourself. Yeah. And I think that boys are like if you look at like someone like Andrew Tate and their videos, they're so carefully constructed to like hit all those like pressure points of boyhood. They're really praying to all the things that boys are taught to want and to value and to feel like are a measure of their worth. And, even just like the language that he uses, like there's so many superhero metaphors in Andrew Tate's language, and you see that right from, superhero is like such a harmless boyhood thing. But at the same time, you're saying, be a superhero, be this like infallible, muscle bound, like saving the day and saving the woman, and the woman's kind of like a prize for your heroism, and like you're going to be Superman or Batman. And then all of which feels really harmless and is really harmless when you're sort of doing it with your 5-year-old. But then Andrew Tate is using all those same tropes and being like, I can be Batman, I've got my Batcave, and so he's just like, boys are primed to like lap this stuff up, and he knows how to exploit it. And then you add in that they're feeling lonely and lost and undervalued and, these things. And he's sort of selling them this promise of like, you can have all these things that you've been taught to want in a million different ways from earliest boyhood,
Yeah, totally. And it gives a playbook and an element of control of, if I do all these things alone, then all these people and things will come to me.
Right. And the value system's already been set up, long before Andrew Tate gets there. They're taught to want that stuff, and they're taught to see that is the measure of their worth. And then he's offering them, it's almost like this sort of self-improvement, self-help scheme that if I act like this, and if I behave like this with women, and if I have the car, and if I have the thing, then I will be this alpha male that is, the sort of underlying, the underlying aim of boyhood, I think.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing I've been thinking about in like the relationship with that kind of messaging is that it's framed as like that's the challenge to go after, and it's really hard to do those things and to get super fit and get rich in the car and all that, when it's in my opinion, it's actually much harder to just go out there in the world and come up against all sorts of uncomfortable nuances in the relationships with a ton of people.
Right.
Really is a mirror back at who you are. Can you connect with other people? Can you have hard conversations?
Right.
Can you have a successful...
Can you be a person in relationship with other people? And I think that we give boys this like extremely poor education in doing that. I remember this time when I was like in the bookstore with my kids when they were really little, and I found this magazine that was like aimed at like tween girls. And so it was like, it had this like pink sparkly cover and this like friendship bracelet giveaway. And it was really clearly like, boys, do not go anywhere near this thing. Your fragile masculinity will just like crumble if you look at this. And I picked this magazine off the shelf and I read it. And like every story was a story about like friendship and navigating friendship boundaries and conflict and emotional labor and all of these things. And I was like, my boys are not getting these messages in the stuff that they read. They get the message that like human interaction is like win or lose. There's a hero, there's a villain, somebody gets covered in glory and gets the girl, and someone gets killed. That's what human interaction is. And I'm like, well, we're really selling boys short with this. This is not how human interaction works in the real world. So you see, they have all these messages seeded really, really young. And then by the time they get to Andrew Tate age, they're like, absolutely primed to see it in that way, to buy what he's selling.
And so when you're I don't know how intentional this was for you or not, but when you're trying to cultivate like, I can relate to my boys and they will be able to relate to me and learn and communicate and conflict with me, how do you build rapport and relational intelligence with
it's really
boys?
hard. It's really hard because I think the culture's working against you in a way. And I think that it's really easy as a mom, I'm obviously like a middle-aged woman and they are young boys. And I think they are taught to believe that I am the like cringiest human or category of human alive. So it's really hard to get those messages across. And, I think they're not going to listen to me giving them a lengthy lecture about the patriarchy, which I'm always like wanting to do. But, and so I think it's really complicated and it's a mixture. I think the way that we are not going to get there is through any kind of shame. I think that it's, loving them, supporting their interests, not shaming them for their interests, but at the same time trying to introduce some of these elements of like care and community and thinking about other people and doing some of that emotional labor that women are taught to take on. But it's a real, it's a real running battle.
Yeah. I was thinking about my mom when you were talking about that. The things we poke fun about her for.
Yeah. I mean, just by existing as a middle-aged woman, you're already like automatically, a little cringy for them.
Yeah. And also, you were talking about community and friendship and care and connection. contrast that with like the time spent online, and like it's a part of life is kids growing up will spend more time that's ever been spent in the history of the world
and
online.
especially boys spend more time online than girls do, and that's something that I think is missing in the discourse. This is like a really gendered phenomenon. Like all kids are spending way more time online, but boys are spending more time online and they're socializing in real life less than girls are. So it's this thing they call displacement, where it's like time spent online is time that you're not spending doing other things that are healthier and better, mainly socializing in person. And that displacement thing is a significantly worse problem for boys than it is for girls at the moment. And and life online is pretty hideous. I think there are algorithms, there is big money from big corporations, pushing boys in the direction of some really, really toxic things. I think that, I would love to see tech companies take more responsibility for this stuff. I think it's perfectly possible for them to do that. But it's this, it is very easy for a teenage boy to like stroll into cyberspace and find himself within 10 minutes in some like deeply, deeply toxic content without doing anything. You search like fitness routine online and like the algorithm feeds you more and more and more kind of extreme content to the point where then you're seeing these extreme misogynistic and horrific things. And I think that, it's a very, very unreal world. I think boyhood there were already like cracks in it. There were already like real flaws in the way that we socialize boys to be kind of not particularly relational, not really see themselves as like social, emotional, relational beings. But then you add the like online layer onto that. And I think it just like, it snowballs into something much scarier.
And so I'm going to add another layer to that, talking about like mental health and approach to mental health and ability to talk about it, work on it, anxiety, depression. How with the layer of like boyhood, how does it intersect with mental health?
I think that there's like I truly believe that there is a really silent epidemic of male mental health problems that are going really unrecognized. And I think that anyone researching this like recognizes that male mental health problems are really underreported. Even in the surveys and the data, it might look like boys are doing okay, but that's not the full story. Partly for the exact same reasons that are causing the mental health problems in the first place, which is like boys don't feel able to talk about their feelings. They don't feel able to report. And often they don't have the kind of grounding and the emotional intelligence and or not so much intelligence, but the like emotional skills to be able to even identify those problems in themselves. And I interviewed many, many young men and boys for the book, for BoyMom. And I was really shocked by how many of them were suffering from low or pretty high level depression or anxiety. It was so common, and loneliness. And they just felt like they were just in this like mush of like, they feel terrible. They don't really know how to name those feelings or really even identify them. And they certainly don't feel able to talk about them. Like I remember I interviewed this one guy, and he shared an apartment with his brother. So they were like at college together. They both lived together. They got along well. They played video games. They had a great time together. But what they didn't realize was that each of them was privately suffering from like really major depression, and they never once talked about it. And when he told me this, I was like, well, how did you find out? And he said, well, my mom told me that my brother was suffering, and that I think he'd also talked to his mom, but they just couldn't find a way to talk to each other about it. And these are brothers who like love and like each other. So I think there's just this like so many barriers to boys and men being able to even like identify the problems in themselves, let alone share them with other people.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. I know it. I was thinking about my brother. We had some of our best conversations playing video games, because it's almost like we're
right. You don't have to look at each other.
But it's real, and it's like, and I'm so glad we were able to do even that, and still do. But it's the element of sharing unloads such a burden.
Yeah.
And it's such a requirement for human health is
Yeah.
just not be alone in the journey.
Totally. I mean, my middle son, he just started middle school. And when he was, so he's in sixth grade now, when he was in fifth grade, I think that the boys were like pretty, they had this really sweet relationship and they would all like have sleepovers and talk about stuff. And I mean, not like really in-depth conversations about feelings or anything, but they were very connected. And I think there's something about this middle school masculinity performance that they've all just like shut down. And I'll say like, why don't you talk to so-and-so about this? Or like, and he's like, boys don't do that, and it's almost this like huge threat, like coming from outside, that he would ever show weakness or show vulnerability. And this is my kid, who's had a million lectures on this stuff. So I think for so many boys, I talked to incels, for this book, and it was just like utter, truly an epidemic of loneliness and depression and terrible feelings, and this feeling that they can't find help, that they don't even know where to begin in like looking at it in themselves, let alone seeking help elsewhere. And I think boys have been taught that their feelings are better expressed through opinions, if you know what I mean. Like, I think the world listens to male opinions. We give like outsized value to male opinions, but we don't really listen to male feelings in the same way. So I think boys are taught to like funnel all their bad feelings into like toxic opinions. So it's just like they all get like reconstituted as like thoughts and, things that they're going to explain to you and whatever. And I think that's what you see happening in incel culture. It's like these boys and young men who have these like terrible pain often and trauma. And they've just kind of like funneled it into the only way they know how to talk about it, which is like misogyny and like these sort of weird political opinions that are really toxic and harmful. But in a way, it's like no wonder that happens, because we don't really give male feelings much airtime.
No, it's a great point, and I've been thinking about this because we do this series in the park, and it's great, and we talk to people about guys about their mental health and strategies that they have, but I have my good friend Jim Chastain brought up a similar concept of like a lot of these he noticed a lot of the conversations would turn into this general third person.
Right. People might,
yeah.
in the abstract.
In the abstract, right, and not just like, I feel this.
Right. And I think boys and men are really taught, they get really reinforced for that behavior. They get really reinforced for stating things as opinions and in the abstract. And people listen to them. We give so much weight to what men say, what men think, but very little to what they feel.
Yeah, the thoughts and the thoughts and opinions and ideas it's almost like cosplaying that I'm getting listened to, like
right,
but
and
it's not really about you,
right? And then it becomes really twisted in the kind of discourse where people are like, why do we care about men? Men have had center stage for so long. Everybody listens to men, nobody listens to women. Shut up, men. But actually, they are being heard, but in the wrong way, in a way that's not really very healthy and doesn't really like actually touch the pain. And when I found that I talked to incels, and sometimes I'd have these like deep conversations, especially with like two in particular that I feature in the book at length. But and when we were starting to talk about their opinions, and I would counter with my opinion, and it would just be this ridiculous like up here conversation where they'd be like, women are terrible, and I'd be like, women are not terrible, women are great. And then they'd be like, no, they're terrible, look at this study that proves that women are terrible. I'd be like, well, look at this study that proves that men are terrible. And it's just like meeting them in this ridiculous space and letting them set the terms of the conversation. But when I was like, okay, look, forget all this, let's just talk about how you feel, how you got here, who are you, what were your parents like, what was your school experience like, how do you feel inside, then often there was just so much pain, and those like opinions would just kind of like crumble, and you would just see that these are like often like really traumatized people who do not feel heard and do not feel like they can go and seek help. And like one guy in particular was like, part of the problem was he's like, I'd love to go to therapy, I would love to seek help, but I'm really scared that the therapist is just going to be like, well, shut up. You have so much privilege. Everyone else has it harder than you. You're a white man. I don't care what you think, which obviously no therapist is ever going to say. But I can see why he feels that about the culture,
Yeah, no, I'm so curious in your boots on the ground research and interviews. It's difficult. I mean, for the reasons you just mentioned, to get like a good faith, honest discussion from
Right.
from those who are really struggling to, I guess, tap into how they feel. Like that's
Yeah.
the a whole piece of the guard
Yeah.
is all those opinions and thoughts that are a lot of vitriol and
Right.
anger as like a defense armor.
Yeah, and I think there's this sort of pressure on journalists as well, or on especially on feminist journalists, not to give them too much airtime, or not to like center men's opinions or feelings or whatever, and to just sort of only fight back and say, well, this is why you're wrong, you know. And I think there's almost this idea that to listen to these people is like a betrayal of feminism in some way. And I just feel like that's such an unhelpful framing, you know. I think that the only way we can get past any of these barriers is to just listen to everybody and proceed with empathy and just be like, well, you know, what are the systemic pressures on you and the individual pressures on you that got you to this point, you know, rather than like, you're terrible, you know.
Mm-hmm. And what do you hope the readers will take away? Like if someone has never heard any of this,
Stuff,
discourse,
yeah. It's
like,
tricky. I mean, I think that, so look, I think that there's like unhelpful stuff on all sides of politics here. I think, you know, men and boys are struggling, and that struggling is due to like a lot of really deep and systemic pressures. And I think, you know, proceed with empathy, proceed with like a nuanced and listening approach. I think that, you know, we can only tackle this with like listening and empathy and care rather than shame and blame. That's never going to get us anywhere. Nobody became a better person by someone telling them that they sucked, you know.
mm-hmm.
You know, that just doesn't work, or shaming people doesn't work. So, yeah, I think it's just like listen to boys. And, you know, from the parenting perspective, I think, you know, it's, well, I mean, there's so many things, but I don't even know where to start. But I think it's like,
you can't teach us all how to be a good parent in 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think, you know, nurturing boys' emotional lives. I think that right from birth, you know, boys and men lose out when it comes to emotion and connection in our patriarchal system. And so I think, you know, to really nurture those emotional, social skills and relational skills in boys.
Yeah, recognizing it's there, and recognizing that it's probably extra work because it's not going to be handed to them systemically.
Right, exactly. So it's just sort of correcting for those biases. I mean, just like you see it in so many ways. I talk about this example of when my son first started kindergarten. Like, so it's his first day. He's like anxious, like what's it going to be like? All the normal feelings that a kid would have on their first day of school. And then when he walks through the gate to the kindergarten yard, there's this guy. He's like a parent volunteer, and he is welcoming all the kids as they walk through the gate. And right in front of my son are these two little girls. And this like big guy, he gets down to their level, and he has this really sweet little voice, and he's like, hi, sweetheart. Hi, sweetheart. And then my son walks through the gate, and he like lifts himself up to his full like 6'2", and his voice drops a full octave, and he's like, hey there, buddy, and like gives him a high five. And like, look, this is hardly toxic masculinity in action. This is like a really great guy on the, you know, volunteering on the kindergarten first day of school. But you see, hi, sweetheart, and hi, buddy are really different messages you're giving those kids. You know, it's like you're saying to the girls, you know, your emotions are welcome here. Your vulnerability is welcome here. We're going to nurture you and protect you. And to the boys, he's saying like, you know, tonally and in his whole way of being, he's like saying, man up, you know, we don't want you to be vulnerable in this space. You know, and that like in and of itself, that moment is like a nothing burger. Who cares? But like when it's replicated hundreds and hundreds of times a day, you know, in like what a boy can expect from the adults in his life, what he can expect from himself, you know, it's a really, really different set of pressures and expectations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's such a clear example of the different treatment that just starts so early on.
So, and it's so small, like in and of itself, like no one's going to be like really complaining about the great kindergarten volunteer who calls the girl sweetheart and the boy's buddy, but you can see like bit by bit. I mean, I remember like literally the labor and delivery nurse called my newborn son buddy when he first came out on his like literal first hour on earth. She's like, "Hey buddy," and I'm like, "Hey buddy," like he's a newborn, you know. And, you know, look, sweetheart has its problems too. That's patronizing. You can see how women get excluded from power bit by bit by bit. But you can also see how boys get excluded from nurture and connection and emotion.
Yeah. And there's a path, like you said, it's a tiny little interaction, but just over time, just many, many repeated.
Yeah, they add up.
It's a very impersonal. There isn't a lot of, you're not about to, hey buddy, into like a vulnerability.
Right, exactly.
So it's a great example of noticing that difference, and that's where it needs to be like complemented with additional thinking about, okay, if this is not happening naturally at school, then where can I fill in?
Where can we find it? Right. And I think, you know, you see it a lot with dads. And like when I do a lot of like talks and things in schools and everything, and like the most common question that I get is like from a mom who's like, I want a parent like this, but like my husband does not. Like my husband is really still on the hey buddy track very firmly. And I feel a lot of empathy with those dads because I'm like, they know that there are real costs in this system to being vulnerable. You know, it's all very well saying to your middle school boy, like, go off and be vulnerable. And he's like, haha, yeah, that's going to work. You know, because he knows that it will come back on him and that there are real meaningful costs. You know, he might well get shamed or bullied or whatever for it. So it's tricky. I think putting that burden onto boys themselves is it's a big ask.
It is a big ask. And like, I know there's the counter of like, okay, well, that's all great, but this is the real world, and I don't want my kid to just be trotted out into the schoolyard and start crying.
Right, exactly. And I think men and dads are often more aware of those risks than women and moms are, just because they've lived it. You know, every adult male alive has grown up under this system. Yep. You know, everywhere in the world it exists.
100%. And it's where you want the cost to be. It's like, okay, we can keep our kids schoolyard number one king and doesn't have to show any vulnerability or learn these skills, but then later when he needs those skills to be a like adjusted thriving human, they won't be there.
They won't be there, right? Because he hasn't been building them up in the same way. And so I think, you know, this is a really complex thing. And I think we do it bit by bit by bit. You know, I wish there was an answer where it's like, do this, watch this video, and then it will. But it's not a quick fix. However, I do think that like cultural change is possible. Like, see how much cultural change, like if you ever watch any movie from the 80s or 90s and you look at like what kind of sexist garbage was just like, or like
they're just homogenous. The story's almost the same.
Right. But you're like, okay, we have moved on since then. Like you look at those movies and you're kind of like, oh, this is aged really, really poorly, and things have changed. And I think things can change for boys and men. I think, but it's like many, many, many small changes all the time from everybody. Yeah.
And I guess that's the counter to like online is so much exposure to everything, but then when there's a greater proliferation of nuance and interesting stories, like those are also more immediately available too. Yeah. So it's not to say that there isn't great stories and great people talking and thinking and filming online.
For sure. And I think, you know, it's like both are happening. Like it's getting worse and it's getting better at the same time. And like people like you who are having these conversations and like doing this work, and many others are doing really, really great work in this space. And that's relatively new. I mean, I think that like when I first started writing this book, it was almost like boyhood, masculinity, that was just like default normal. And everyone else should be sort of aiming to be more like that. You know, you heard like feminism, girl power, lean in, you know, it was like everyone be more like men. And it's only recently that there's this kind of mass conversation where we're like, actually, these things aren't so great for men either. And, you know, we need to look at this.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about this middle ground approach of it's almost like this learning and realization that, like, of course you want a boy wants really amazing friends that he can tell everything to, but it's almost like testing the waters to see like which friends you can do that with.
How to do it, I mean, have you heard of this thing called jock insurance? So I heard about this concept, and it was really interesting to me, which is like often like the boys with the most like social capital, so like the jock, the guy who's already like succeeding in all the systems of masculinity, has the most freedom to be vulnerable, to sort of step outside of those norms. So like if you're already the captain of the football team or whatever it is, it's easier sometimes to be vulnerable and to like, whereas the boy who's like struggling to keep up, it's much more of a burden on him, and he'll have much greater costs in doing that. And I remember that I interviewed these two friends in the book, and they were like college roommates, and one of them had been in this like he'd gone to boarding school, and it was this like incredibly toxic masculine environment where they'd had like every week they'd had this thing called fight night where they just like beat up an 8th grader. That was like the thing. And it was like the school like totally supported it, and it was just like everyone turned up to see this, you know. So and he went after college, and he was like, said he'd never had an open or vulnerable conversation with any friend, including his twin brother. No one had seen him cry since he was 5 years old. You know, he was like deep in it. And his college roommate was this guy who was really like taught him to open up and like told him to go to a therapist, and you know, but this guy was only able to do it because he already had all this like masculine social capital, and he was like sporty and popular with girls and like all of these things, you know what I mean? So it was like easier for him to move. And then it was a very sweet story where they became very close friends, and the other guy did open up.
Totally. And like I do know the phenomenon you're talking about, and I think it's interesting because it from the visible outside it looks like, oh, it's the looks, like that's what's leading to this thriving life, when it could be the underneath, if like, oh, because you look like that and have this capital, now you're able to have all these
to do all the things that make you healthy. And
exactly. So it's important to
look at both.
Look at both. And I think it is, I also see it online where it's like, if you have a really strong figure like a Dwayne The Rock Johnson or Chris Bumstead was Mr. Olympia, like they've had these clips online of, oh, I like really struggle, I'm really down right now, or I'm sad, and everyone's like, oh, like this is incredible, he's opening up. And but if someone, a very frail alternative looking person is saying that, it's, oh, this is weak. And so it's received very differently.
Right. So true. Yeah.
So it's tough because like you want role models to be doing that, and often role models are in the positions of just where the system has rewarded them for
and it wouldn't necessarily reward somebody else for doing the same thing. But I think there can be a trickle down effect where the more people, you know, the more of those people who are doing it and modeling it, then you know it can eventually trickle down and become like really normalized in the culture.
100%. So it's tricky because like those who can succeed within the system are able to kind of break out of it.
Right, exactly. They have more freedom. But then on the flip side, what I found when I interviewed the incels and I went on incel forums is like, what was really weird about the incels is like, they'd almost like given up on the system. Like they saw themselves as so low down on that hierarchy.
Be rewarded.
Right. That there was just like, there's no way I'm ever going to be an alpha male. I'm just like, you know, in their belief, like I'm short, I'm unattractive, I can't get women and whatever. But it was almost, that was equally freeing, like in a terrible way. But they were like, well, screw it all, because I'm never going to be that. I might as well just like open up. And what was really interesting is on those incel forums, there was like all this outpouring of talk about mental health and struggling and depression and support and community. But in also alongside this like incredibly misogynistic, toxic, terrible language. And it was like, it was kind of both coexisting. And I think, but the guys I talked to felt this real freedom where they're like, suddenly I can just go and admit to being lonely and a loser and like all of these things with other with other guys. And that was strange because I've been looking, like the whole time I was reporting this book, I was like, where will I find these spaces where men can be really open and vulnerable? And I was like, I'll find it in like a therapy room or like with some sort of like vegan, like whatever. And it was like the complete opposite. It was like in the like literal toxic masculinity central that I did find this like opening up.
Yeah, no, in the trenches.
Right.
And I think you touched on it, is like it's when it's kind of like exiting out the bottom of like screw the system.
Yeah.
And I think that is freeing, and like that is
right, but in a terrible way.
In a terrible way.
Yeah, it's just like opting out of society altogether, and often like in a way that becomes incredibly violent and scary, and
Mm-hmm. But it's like if those at the top, like as they perceive on this totem pole, are like able to like exit the system and talk about their feelings, and like that's really the key.
Right, not this. Yeah, not the like incel at the bottom. Yeah, for sure. But it was interesting because I think for me it was very both scary and really important to see how that worked, because it's like they are so desperate for those feelings of belonging and connection, and they don't have them elsewhere, so they're looking for them in these like toxic spaces. So we do really need to work to provide those things in real life outside for boys and men. And I've seen like really good examples of it working in real life. Like I know in San Francisco, near where I live, there's like a lot of boys groups, and I can see that there's like a lot of good evidence that those work, that when you have someone really intentional, like working with boys and getting them to open up, and boys like love those spaces. They end up really, really loving them when they're given permission to do them.
Totally. The structure matters.
And the leader matters, who's going to facilitate it.
Totally. And then I think the other, I don't know if you have thoughts on this, I think like being able to handle the rejection and failure of like trying to do some of these things and then just not giving up, like feeling the shame or the embarrassment, and it's like, okay,
that's all right.
I'm gonna try again.
Yeah.
And I think that's really tough because structurally just huge punishments for those experiences and feelings.
Yeah, and I think, it's like this, back to this impossible masculinity thing. Like if you're taught that your worth depends on never showing weakness, never failing, never being vulnerable, being this like, bulletproof superhero individual, then rejection and failure is way worse. It's not just like a bad thing that happens to you. It's like this total annihilation of your sense of self-worth, and who you are.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it, I think the schooling is really important because it's some of the first introductions to like social structures and systems, and the group mentality of pointing out a weakness or a difference is like a very scary feeling for like a human outside the herd kind of vibe.
So true. And I think that's why like schools should do this really intentionally. I mean, I spent some time at the Browning School in New York. I don't know if you're aware of them, but they're this very, very like fancy, expensive, like private school. I think the Rockefellers went there, and every state governor, and goodness knows who. Anyway, but they had this curriculum called Modern Masculinities, and it was doing critical thinking around masculinity and around like these stereotypes and these norms and like these pressures, and they got boys to talk about them and to like really dissect them as part of the curriculum, and it's been really, really successful and helpful for them. And it was this model that I was like, I haven't seen this elsewhere, but I think this could really work if it's, and I think like now, especially I live in Berkeley, California, which is this really progressive place. And you see like a lot of great work in the curriculum around like anti-racism or, whatever. But I think there hasn't been the same work done on deconstructing masculinity norms in the same way that gives boys and everyone like a sort of vocabulary and a framework to talk about it and to think about it,
Yeah, and I think that's like the school environment is the right place to just prompt the ideas, like
to do that, right?
It's not a prescription. Yeah. It's just these are forces in the system that like here they are,
and like, here they are, and let's look at them and let's see them in movies and see them in online and see them in books and see them, because they're everywhere. Once you start seeing it, it's really hard to unsee it. But, and I think that we've done a really good job of that to a certain extent with girls and women. Like, I think most fifth grade girls can like spot sexism when it happens. Like, they're pretty good. They've got these like critical faculties where they're like, oh yeah, that's sexist. When the prince rescues the princess or the princess is incapable or whatever, they'll see the sexist like stereotype and they'll be like, we don't want this. But I think boys, there's just like not the same language or framework to be able to like fully talk about it or understand it or notice it, or I think they need more of a education in that.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing is like how this moves in the macro. It's like if you think about various decades, I'm thinking about like American decades, like the gender roles, you can really picture each decade.
Right. 1950s, the briefcase, and they're like
totally
women in the kitchen.
It's obviously it can change. And it's just changed enormous amounts.
Yeah, it can change, but it kind of keeps reinventing itself along the same principles as well. It's like the aesthetics change, but the substance doesn't, in a weird way. But having said that, like I think women have, it's certainly not complete, and there's a huge backlash and all of that, many caveats. But women have made genuine progress in the world, in society, etc., and in their roles and what they can expect from themselves and from others. And I think that hasn't happened in the same way for men for various reasons. But it's starting to happen. We're doing it. Here we are doing it. And, you're doing it. But yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. And like for women, I mean, the economic and educational outcomes have just been very dramatically improved. And so it's like in the numbers. And then I think, as you said, that there hasn't been the same progress, I think, on the like the men's health outcomes. Right, like the mental health outcomes are worse. Are
getting worse. And the sort of pressures of masculinity should be like easing, but instead they're like ramping up. The sort of stereotypes, the sort of rigid stereotypes and what men are expected to perform. We should be like lessening those pressures, but instead we're like, increasing them in a way.
Yeah. Did you know what you were getting into with the book? Yeah.
No, I didn't. And it was, but in a way, I'm kind of really glad that I didn't know, because I went into talking to these people with no agenda. I really was just like talking to boys, like saying, just tell me about your life. Like, what concerns you? What are you worried about? What do you love? What do you hate? Tell me about you. And I wasn't like doing that journalistic thing of having a story in mind and trying to like fit the thing. And I think that helped them to trust me, and to open up to me, because I think they sensed that I wasn't really like doing a thing. I was just like
learning,
really interested in their lives. And I think these boys, I'd expected when I was going to interview teenage boys, I thought like it was going to be blood from a stone. I was like, it's just going to be grunting and monosyllables. But it was like the complete opposite. They were like desperate to talk. They went on and on, in the most lovely and articulate way. They just, every conversation like went hours over what I'd scheduled, because I think they felt so unheard and like nobody's listening. So
what was, I guess it would be hard to be surprised if you went in without expectations, but what were your own personal takeaways for what you learned?
I mean, I think probably the biggest surprise was how often loneliness came up.
Yeah.
And you hear all this stuff now about the male loneliness epidemic and all the rest of it. But like, I hadn't really heard that narrative so much. And it was just like absolutely there and present in every conversation. And often, like, sometimes these were guys that like were like genuinely pretty isolated. But often they really had a lot of friends and buddies and people to hang out with. It wasn't like they were on their own. But they just felt like their friendships were so superficial and they couldn't like really address these like deeper things. And I thought that they'd be like, oh, well, that's the way we like it. We just want it to be like that. But that really wasn't what they were saying at all. They were like, I desperately crave this deeper connection, but I just have no idea how to go about getting it,
Yeah. And I totally, I think it's again, structurally, there's not a lot of support and help to maintain those, and it requires the extra work.
It really
that is
does.
super worth it.
Yeah, it's really worth it. But I think I was sort of surprised by how hard it is to be a boy or a man. I think I'd sort of, growing up a girl and a woman and being a feminist, and I was so aware of all the challenges and pressures and like disadvantages of being female. And I think I'd just been like, kind of in the back of my mind, like, well, men are doing great. They have all the privilege, they have all the power, everything works out for them. And then I think doing this was a real like humbling lesson in like, actually, this is really hard for men too. And I wouldn't switch places, for all the chance that men have to like be the president or run the like Fortune, whatever company. What I wrote in the book is like, under patriarchy, men get everything except the thing that's most worth having, and I'm like, I was like very grateful to not have to deal with that,
Yeah, no, it's that's poignant to, give you everything, but like that which will really
that
fulfill
will
you.
like benefit you or like benefit
No,
others.
it's so poisonous, and it's because it promises all these rewards, and they can sometimes feel really good.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's robbing you of
like your full humanity. And so, as a person, I'm sort of like relieved not to have to deal with that for myself, but for my sons, it's just like such a scary thought that is the world that they are born into. That's the, it's almost like a half-life that, that men get, I think, which is so sad.
Right, because if humanity is just how hard you can feel things, or else like what is the goal of like trying to do well and thrive? It's like,
exactly, like
feel
great,
all these
you
feelings.
can have all the power in the world, but if you don't have deep human connection, then like it's empty. It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, and so I think that is such a like crisp way of just showing how the patriarchy in the system, like the rewards just are false, and they hurt all of us.
Right, exactly. It's almost like a kind of like a Greek myth where it's like you can have everything, but at this like deep cost to your humanity.
And I think just learning or acknowledging that exists out there is kind of a way to start to begin to defeat the system.
Yeah,
and that's kind of locking guys in a cage away from experiencing full humanity, range of emotions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a really powerful way to talk about the system that you like investigated and reported on, and how it influences and impacts your own life as a boy mom. So I know we're coming up on the last few minutes here. So anything else that we haven't covered, or messages for the audience that you wanted to share, or where people can find you as well?
I think we've covered most of it. I mean, people can find me online at ruthwhipman.com. I write a Substack called I Blame Society. And I run discussion groups every month about masculinity and boyhood and all of these issues that we've talked about. So anyone can show up to those if they want to join. And obviously the book is BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Such a pleasure.
Incredible
Thanks.
Conversation. I know I learned a lot, and I'm grateful that our audience will get to listen to.
It's been great talking with you. Thank you so much.